Welcome to the class video for Module 9, in which we'll be looking at John Adams's A Defense of the Constitutions of the United States. We don't have to do a lot of work to set up the historical context for this text. Adams is commenting on and evaluating pretty clearly the two constitutional models that we looked at in Module 8. A unicameral legislature is expressed in the Pennsylvania Constitution, and a bicameral legislature, as we saw in the New York Constitution. The primary theme that we want to get out of this text is Adams's critique of direct democracy. You should think of this text as the counter-argument to Thomas Paine's Common Sense and his depiction of a simple natural government in which every man should have a natural right to a seat, if you recall. As you can imagine, criticizing democracy in the era of democratic revolution does not make one a particularly popular writer. And that's a primary reason, as we'll see, that Adams's text remains a kind of obscure secondary or even tertiary text in the canon of the Revolution. But his analysis is illustrative of the transition we want to follow in the final part of the course toward the federal constitutional model. The Madisonian turn is fundamentally a critique of direct democracy as it was expressed in Paine. Madison, as we'll see, is going to be a little more artful in the way he describes that critique. He's going to soften his compared to Adams. But what we want to see in Adams is this fundamental conceptual transition. Adams is going to describe a form of natural law in which the primary metaphor are the laws of physics, that natural law mandates a balance of political forces, and without that, any system is going to go off the rails, is going to become unbalanced. And so he's going to kind of steal this Lockean metaphor of natural law, this idea that's so central to 18th century social contract thinking or theory of democratic revolution, but he's going to adapt that concept of natural law to this Aristotelian principle of checking and balancing different divisions of government in order to create balance. That metaphor of physics balancing contending forces in nature is foundational to Madison's conception of a federal constitutional order. The other component of Adams's critique of democracy is to identify a value that is higher than the value of democracy. That is to say, the primary value that democracy expresses is every individual's natural right to participate in the laws by which they're governed. Again, harken back to Paine's Common Sense. In that first simple parliament, every man will by nature have a right to a seat. Adams acknowledges the value of that principle, but sets another principle even higher, the principle of the common good. If direct democracy does not actually work in producing laws that protect the common good, then we have to find a different form of government that will do so. And the way to do that is to only permit those who are the most virtuous into office. The rule of virtue will secure the common good better than the rule of every individual's natural right to participate in government. So there must be constraints on that democratic principle in order to achieve this higher good, the common good. That logic is foundational to the transition away from the revolutionary state constitutions towards the federal model, the Madisonian turn, that will be our primary focus in the final movement of the course. So your assignments for this module are to read Adams's defense, take the Adams reading quiz, and you'll notice here in Module 9, and again in the next module, Module 10, we have a comparatively lighter workload. And that's intentional. Here, the videos should be a little bit shorter because we're not going to spend 40 minutes on historical context. And the reading for Module 10, of course, is the Federal Constitution, a short reading, hopefully that you've already run through once, at least in this semester, and so should not be a major workload. That's intentional here in Module 9 and 10 to give you some time to dig into your textual genealogy. As we finish Module 9, we're coming to the end of that middle portion of the course. And if you recall the writing requirements for the textual genealogy, the middle portion of your final paper is essentially a 2 to 3 page essay on the text from this middle portion of the course. So this is a great time in the semester for you to not just highlight off passages you might use, but actually go back through modules, what would it be now, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and actually draw out a little outline, think about the thesis that will guide this from what you wrote from your concept essay, and start to actually put some meat on the bones of your idea for your final paper. As always, I'm more than happy to look over your outlines and to meet with you and talk about your progress on the paper. Okay, that said, let's turn now to the text and look at John Adams's very unpopular critique of the principles of democracy. The context or purpose of Adams's work is evident from the complete title, which is A Defense of the Constitutions of the Government of the United States of America against the Attack of M. Turgot in his letter to Dr. Price, dated the 22nd day of March, 1778. And that is quite a mouthful, quite a fulsome title, but typical of the late 18th century. Now, you may be best aware of John Adams as the second president of the United States in the late 1790s. You may be less familiar with his specific contribution during the Revolutionary period. Adams was a kind of famous country lawyer in Boston in the early period of imperial protests and defended different people who were being charged by the British for violating the new Acts of Parliament. That's where he kind of got his colonial reputation. He was sent as a delegate on behalf of Massachusetts to the first two Continental Congresses, and then his primary service during the war and the years after was as a diplomat or ambassador on behalf of the new United States to the various governments of Europe, trying to convince those governments, especially during the war, to recognize the United States as an independent nation from Great Britain. So Adams spent the greater part of the revolution itself living in different European capitals, attending meetings with government officials, writing essays in the local newspapers, sort of trying to defend what the British colonists were doing, trying to argue for the legitimacy of the American cause for independence, and in general trying to shape the European intellectuals' view of or perspective on those crazy colonists over there in North America, and whether anybody thought they had a real shot of getting out from underneath the British Empire. So this work was prompted by a published letter from this guy, M. Turgot, or Michel Turgot, to this other guy, Dr. Price, or Richard Price. Richard Price is a Briton, he's a member of Parliament, and he is famously on that wing of Parliament that is most sympathetic to the colonist cause. That is, during the period of imperial protest, the ones who were advocating for a conciliatory policy to make concessions in response to the colonist complaints, and then once the war broke out, being most advocating for a kind of soft reconciliation policy, not to try to defeat the colonists in battle, but to try to reconcile them back within the empire. So essentially, Richard Price is a lefty in Parliament, in the British public opinion. Not popular, of course, during the war itself, but someone who the colonists' opinion, whose opinion the colonists greatly respect and solicit. He can be essentially an advocate for them within British public opinion. Michel Turgot is an official in the French government under Louis XVI. You realize here in the late 1770s, we're just a decade or a little more from the French Revolution. Louis XVI's government is sort of teetering on collapse, and Turgot is a kind of liberal, reforming, essentially an economist or a finance minister. He's best known, his writings are best known as some of the foundational writings of what we call classical economics. That is the period of Adam Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and all of that. Turgot is a kind of important secondary writer in that literary canon. So he's an official in the French government. He is one of those officials who is anticipating something cataclysmic happening if there aren't fundamental reforms in the government. And despite all, against all resistance by the reactionaries and the defenders of Bourbon privilege, he is one of those guys who is trying to get Louis to reform the monarchy so that it can be sustainable. So he's a kind of famous lefty within French politics and French intellectual opinion. So Adams, whose primary job during the Revolution is to shape European intellectual opinion about what those crazy Americans are trying to do over there and establishing their own country, then is prompted to respond to this letter that Turgot wrote to Price and was subsequently published, and sort of people around Europe, important people around Europe, were aware that this French liberal had a kind of bad opinion about what the Americans were up to and the new constitutions that they were writing. The essential context to understand is that these are people, Turgot and Price, are people that Americans like Adams very much want them to think well of what the Americans are doing, right? They're trying to solicit a positive opinion of this new United States of America, that it is authentically and sincerely trying to fulfill the values that European writers have been articulating since Locke, the principles of the social contract, the principles of the rights of democratic revolution. And so that's the context for this writing. We can start then with the opening paragraph. I've given you just one chapter. This is a very long work. It's well over 600 pages, and Adams intended it to be a kind of comprehensive tome of American political science. We're going to look at just one example of the different features of the constitutions that he's trying to defend, and it's the one that is most obvious from the previous module, that is the contrast between a unicameral legislature and a bicameral legislature. And Adams sets that up here in the first paragraph at the top of the left-hand column of page 2. As it is impossible to suppose that M. Turgot intended to recommend to the Americans a simple monarchy or aristocracy, we have admitted as a supposition the most favorable to him that by collecting all authority into one center, he meant a single assembly of representatives of the people, without a governor and without a senate. And although he has not explained whether he would have the assembly chosen for life or years, we will again admit as the most benign construction that he meant that the representatives should be annually chosen. So notice the correspondence here. Turgot is a French thinker, and notice how Rousseauian is his central assertion, as we have to kind of read it in the convex from Adams's description. The core assertion that Adams describes Turgot making is that those Americans should be collecting all authority into one center. Right? That's the key phrase, and the rest of these are Adams's suppositions of what Turgot must have meant. Well, that's a very Rousseauian idea, if you remember the general will, collecting all authority into one center. Adams deduces from that he must be asserting a unicameral legislature, a single assembly of representatives of the people, without a governor, without a senate, etc. In other words, very much like the Pennsylvania model that we discussed in Module 8. So notice that Turgot, who supposedly is making this attack, is advocating for the most egalitarian or democratic model, right? Turgot is as advocating as Adams constructs him here. Those Americans should put all authority into one center. They should have a single assembly with all power. If Adams is defending, right, the supposed attack, then that puts Adams in the position of advocating for a less democratic model, right? That's the point for you to understand about the context here. Turgot is, if you will, on the left of, or more liberal than, or more egalitarian, or more radically democratic than what Adams is going to advocate for as the correct model, or the model that'll have the best outcomes. So this is not a defense from an attack from somebody advocating for monarchy or for an authoritarian government. This is an attack from someone who's claiming to be even more liberal than those Americans, even more egalitarian than those Americans, and those Americans are not living up to their revolutionary creed of establishing truly democratic governments. If they did, if they were living up to their revolutionary creed, then they would all have unicameral legislatures. They would all have one body, one assembly of the representatives of the people. Now, Adams's first move here, then, is to cite Turgot for misunderstanding a quotation from Ben Franklin. Supposedly in his letter, Turgot wrote that Dr. Franklin doesn't like this bicameral legislature either. When it was proposed to him in the Pennsylvania Constitution, which of course is the state that went with the unicameral legislature, Ben Franklin responded with the following anecdote at the bottom of the left-hand column of 2, quote, "Two assemblies appeared to him like a practice he had somewhere seen of certain wagoners who, when about to descend a steep hill with a heavy load, if they had 4 cattle, took off one pair from before, and chaining them to the hinder part of the wagon, drove them uphill, while the pair before and the weight of the load overbalancing the strength of those behind, drew them slowly and moderately down the hill." So Turgot apparently heard this anecdote from Ben Franklin and interpreted it to mean that Franklin was mocking the idea of a bicameral legislature. That's as silly as separating your oxen and putting them in front of and behind a cart. Adams's retort here is simply, no, Turgot, you must never have had to hook a team of oxen up to a wagon before. What Franklin is saying is, this is a completely practical and effective method of balancing the weight between 2 different forces. And that's the underlying principle that Adams is trying to draw to here. If we come down to the middle of the right-hand column on 2, he has this example from Harrington and how to divide up the cake, how his children will divide up the cake, but he points then at about halfway down the column to the underlying principle of physics. He says, Harrington, too, instead of his children dividing and choosing their cake, might have alluded to those attractions and repulsions by which the balance of nature is preserved, or to those centripetal and centrifugal forces by which the heavenly bodies are continued in their orbits instead of rushing to the sun or flying off in tangents among comets and fixed stars. Impelled or drawn by different forces in different directions, they are blessings to our own inhabitants and the neighboring systems. But if they were drawn only by one, they would introduce anarchy wherever they should go. There is no objection to such illusions, whether simple or sublime, so far as they amuse the fancy and illustrate an argument. All that is insisted on is that whatever there is in them of wit or argument is all in favor of a complication of forces, of more powers than one, of 3 powers indeed, because a balance can never be established between 2 orders in society without a third to aid the weakest. This is a foundational conceptual point to understand. Madison and then Publius, which is Madison under a pseudonym, is going to refer again and again to these balances of the forces of nature, to centripetal and centrifugal forces and holding the heavenly bodies in their orbits. That will be Madison's essential conception of the federal structure between federal government and state governments. They're like the sun and the planets. The tension between them, the balance of forces between them, is what holds them in equilibrium. Without one or the other, each would be destroyed. Nature is built on these opposition of forces. So notice how Adams here is claiming a kind of natural law in the way in which Locke aspired to, right? That Locke wanted us to believe that reason was the foundation of natural law because he had this scientific revolution model of what reason is, and he thought it would be universal if we could just understand the evidence. Here's a different way of adapting the natural law category to a different kind of metaphor, the metaphor of physics, which demands multiplicity, right? Physics doesn't work if there's only one particle. It's inherently about the relationship between masses, and especially masses in motion. So it's foundationally dynamic. And that's what Adams is trying to do here. And the critiques of the kind of Thomas Paine model of natural democracy, of simple and direct democracy, will employ this kind of physics as an example of natural law to communicate the necessity of division and opposition. That division and opposition are in fact good. They're an expression of nature. If you recall Tom Paine, he said he didn't like complicated governments simply because they were complicated, right? He liked simple governments, by which he meant either the rule of the one, the rule of the few, or the rule of the many. And of course, the rule of the one and the rule of the few were antithetical to equality, so a simple form of the rule of the many. That's a simple form of government, a concentrated form of government. And through this analogy of physics, using physics as a metaphor for describing political institutions, the critics of direct democracy are trying to lay claim to this social contract tradition, to the metaphors or the vocabulary of the theory of democratic revolution, indeed to form a counter-argument to direct democracy, right? So what are those divisions in society? What are the forces that have to be divided and set against each other? That's the next subject that Adams is going to tackle. We'll turn to that. Now, as we turn to see Adams describe those forces, we see how much he is trapped in an Aristotelian perspective. That is to say, Adams is struggling to get out of that division of the one, the few, and the many, and to embrace popular democracy. He cannot think of a critique of democracy that does not bring him back to the essential virtues of those Aristotelian categories. So what are the forces that have to be divided in society? Well, it's simply that some people are better than others, is Adams's conclusion. That is to say, he rejects the core principle of both Locke and Rousseau, natural equality. Picking up on the highlighted passage here on page 3 in the left-hand column, let us now return to M. Turgot's idea of a government consisting in a single assembly. He tells us our republics are founded on the equality of all the citizens, and therefore orders and equilibriums are unnecessary and occasion disputes. But what are we here to understand by equality? And then coming down to the final part of that paragraph, it must be acknowledged that in every state, in the Massachusetts, for example, there are inequalities which God and nature have planted there and which no human legislator can ever eradicate. Take a moment to take in the breadth of rejection of core revolutionary principles here, right? Think back to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights are. What is Adam saying here? That there are inequalities which God and nature have planted there and which no human legislator can ever eradicate. He is flipping the bird, right, to the Declaration of Independence and its soppy, romantic, ephemeral notion of human equality. Now, what are those natural sources of inequality? He finds three. Highlighted down at the bottom of the left-hand column, there's an inequality of wealth. On the right-hand column, there's an inequality by birth. And then here on page 4, the inequality of reputation, which he summarizes at the top of the right-hand column of 4. There are a few in whom all these advantages of birth, fortune, and fame are united. So this group is distinct not simply or because they are rich. They are rich because they are the best people in society. They are the natural aristocracy in the summarizing paragraph highlighted on the right-hand column of 4. These sources of inequality, which are common to every people and can never be altered by any, because they are founded in the constitution of nature. This natural aristocracy among mankind has been dilated on because it is a fact essential to be considered in the institution of a government. It forms a body of men which contains the greatest collection of virtues and abilities in a free government, is the brightest ornament and glory of the nation, and may always be made the blessings of society if it be judiciously managed in the Constitution. But if this be not done, it is always the most dangerous, nay, it may be added, it never fails to the destruction of the commonwealth. So Adams thinks that there is a cohort among every population that just is the strongest and the brightest and the most ambitious and the most sort of seeking of reputation and renown in their community. And those people will inevitably be powerful. The Constitution will decide whether their power gets channeled for good or their power gets channeled for evil. Now, this should make you think back to those passages in Rousseau in which he described the best form of aristocracy as an elected aristocracy, because an election would identify the truly virtuous and the truly wise, rather than merely identifying those who had the most wealth or the hereditary claim to aristocratic rule. But at the root here, and what Rousseau himself is alluding back to, and you might have had a chance to read in Foundations of the American Experience, is Aristotle's concept of the polity. If you did get a chance to read Aristotle's Politics, he describes the perfect form of government is that government in which the virtuous get to rule, whether they are one, few, or many in a society, but the credential for participating in society or in civil society and government is to be virtuous and good. And if you could define those participation requirements on that, which is impossible to distinguish, right? That's why it's perfect and it's impossible to achieve. But the ultimate form of government would be the government in which everybody got to participate because everyone was virtuous. And Aristotle refers to that as a polity. But it's too perfect to ever be achieved. It's just a model to think about. And then Aristotle brings us back down to earth and says, but you got to pick among these other forces. And that's the significance here. If Adams is attempting to articulate a critique of Tom Paine's Common Sense, right, and the Declaration of Independence, and where he goes to is the most virtuous cohort, the most benevolent and admirable cohort within classical constitutional science. And this is, in the moment that it's written, to make Adams a counter-revolutionary. That's why this book is not a canonical text of the American Revolution, and in fact was a kind of millstone around Adams's neck, around his reputation as a kind of snob, as a kind of snooty, as an aristocrat, as an elitist. Now that, of course, is ironic because he, like Hamilton, you might be familiar with the play Hamilton, you might have some familiarity with Alexander Hamilton's background. Hamilton's another character who his reputation among the founding generation is as an elitist, as an aristocrat, as a snob, as pretentious, but come from the most humble backgrounds, in fact. Whereas other characters of the Revolution, like, say, Thomas Jefferson, who's known as the great common man, the great egalitarian, the great radical Democrat, in fact, his origins are quite aristocratic and snobby. He has inherited a great tobacco plantation and fortune, or actually married into it. Nevertheless, it is exactly these opinions expressed in this text in the mid-1780s which cast Adams as an aristocratic, anti-democratic, counter-revolutionary, and that's the rhetorical challenge that the advocates for the new federal constitution are going to have to overcome. When we get to Publius, that is James Madison writing under the pseudonym of Publius, we'll see how different his rhetoric is. That Madison's theoretical goal is to describe the necessity of division, checks, and balances, but to not fall into this trap then of identifying a natural aristocracy. The kind of genius of executive, legislative, judicial as a replacement for the one, the few, and the many is that executive, legislative, judicial merely describes, if you will, kind of abstract administrative functions. They're the fundamental tools or instruments that any government has to contain. They don't refer to social classes in the way that the one, the few, and the many is intrinsically a description of rich and poor, right? That is the heart of Aristotelian political theory, is that politics is a battle of rich and poor, and constitutions are the attempts of society to contain that endemic struggle, that's the fundamental struggle of every society. Adams does not want to fall back into the rhetoric of the rich deserve their own body in the legislature because they're rich, because property is more important than personhood. And so he's trying to come up with a language of virtue here, right? That what the elite are is not necessarily rich, or if they're rich, it's by incidental, it's a consequence of their underlying skill and virtue, that what we're really identifying is a natural aristocracy. And that is the solution that he proposes in the following paragraph. What do we do with this group of super talented, super virtuous people? If we don't want them to be corrupted, then in the highlighted line, we throw them all, or at least the most remarkable of them, into one assembly together in the legislature. And that, in Adams's mind, is the purpose of the Senate in a bicameral legislative structure. But before we get to that, because he's going to work his way back to this role of the Senate to contain the natural aristocracy, he wants to sort of hypothesize what's the chaos or the anarchy that comes about when you only have a single legislative body, or a unicameral legislature. He says in the middle of the left-hand column of 5, let us then reflect how the single assembly in the Massachusetts, in which our great statesman wishes all authority concentrated, that is, M. Turgot is our great statesman, he's being a little satirical, that our great statesman wishes all authority concentrated, will be composed. Next highlighted passage, the House will be found to have all the inequalities in it that prevailed among the people at large. Such an assembly will be naturally divided into 3 parts. The first is some great genius, right? The one. The next highlighted line. The second division comprehends a third or a quarter, or if you will, a sixth or an eighth of the whole, and consists of those who have the most to boast of, resembling their head, right? That is their brain, their reasoning, right? They have the most to boast of, resembling their head. And in the third class are all the rest. So here we have in succinct form Aristotle's the one, the few, and the many. Some great genius, a second division who have the most to boast of resembling their head, and then all the rest. Now, what's the consequence of those naturally divided forces or naturally distinct forces all having to compete, if you will, on one court or in one arena? The highlighted passage on the right-hand side of 5. A single assembly thus constituted, without any counterpoise, balance, or equilibrium, is to have all authority, legislative, executive, and judicial, concentrated in it. It is to make a constitution and laws by its own will, execute those laws at its own pleasure, and adjudge all controversies that arise concerning the meaning and application of them at its own discretion. What is there to restrain it from making tyrannical laws in order to execute them in a tyrannical manner? And here we arrive at a great and foundational conceptual paradox with democratic theory. Can a democratic government pass tyrannical laws? That is to say, a government that is truly democratic, right? A government that is sincerely and authentically and effectively exercising the people's will. Could such a government tyrannize the people? Wouldn't whatever that government did be the people's will? Isn't it a paradox to imagine that the people could tyrannize themselves? And if we think of tyranny as changes of the fundamental rules of government in the Lockean sense, aren't the fundamental rules whatever the people want at any given moment, since they have the power to decide what the Constitution is? Right? They have the power to make a Constitution and laws by their own will. This, if you recall, was one of the Rousseauian paradoxes with the general will. As soon as the people act, they're no longer the people, and they have to become something less than the people to act in a governmental form, right? Or in a magisterial form, as Rousseau described it. Or if we think back to Locke's struggles to define tyranny, Locke could not imagine that Parliament could pass a law that would be unconstitutional. The problem with the king enforcing the law was the king did not represent the people's will. Since Parliament did, Parliament could be the umpire. Locke could not imagine the problem of who can be the umpire over Parliament. Locke imagined that whatever Parliament did would be, referee-ish, right? Would be neutral and objective, that it would embody the people's will. One of the hardest conceptual problems that the critics of the revolutionary state constitutions and those who start to advocate for the federal model, one of the hardest rhetorical or conceptual problems that they have to overcome in their revolutionary culture is convincing their cohort that a majority in a genuinely popular government can in fact impose tyrannical laws, that it can do it on themselves, the majority can tyrannize over themselves, and certainly the majority can tyrannize over the minority, even within a democratic and genuinely representative system. This is a paradox that's not immediately evident in the 17th, certainly in the 17th and through the first half of the 18th century. And one of the genuinely unique contributions of the American writers, especially those writers we associate with the Madisonian turn or the embrace of the federal model, is exactly their engagement with this question. What can you do in a democratic system when the majority is acting tyrannically? Who can be a power higher than the majority within a democracy? And we'll see the ultimate answer to this for the course in the final week of the semester in Publius's writing. This is a good place to break the video here so we don't get an hour-long video. We can have 2 medium-length videos, and we'll see then Adams try to build an architecture around this question. How can you know that the majority is acting tyrannically? What is the architecture that will assure not just that the majority rules, but that the common good prevails? And we'll pick that up next in the next segment of the class video.